For my comparison and contrast presentation, I decided to compare George Orwell's 1984 and Nahir Mahfouz's Happy Man. Theme and thesis: the dystopian novel 1984 by George Orwell and the short story Happy Man by Naguib Mahfouz demonstrates that happiness cannot be achieved through the forceful suppression of all negative emotions. Both literature showcases this through how individuals become mentally frustrated when unable to vent using negative emotions, such as grief. This is also observed when, because of the lack of negative emotions, individuals lose their relationships with others, forcing them into social isolation. This is significant because it enables the reader to grasp that true satisfaction in life cannot be achieved by forcing happiness. It is achieved through a healthy relationship with the positive and negative emotions. My first point that proves my thesis is that suppressing one's negative emotions does not form happiness. It causes individuals to become frustrated, not happy, because of their inability to release their emotions through feelings like sadness and grief. Winston and the man both feel frustrated that they're unable to cope with difficulties using negative emotions. Both characters are bursting with emotions and are unable to vent using emotions such as grief. In the story 1984, the main character Winston says, "The thing that now suddenly struck Winston was that his mother's death, nearly 30 years ago, had been tragic and sorrowful in a way that was no longer possible. Tragedy, he perceived, belonged to an ancient time, to a time where there was still privacy, love, and friendship. Today there was fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity of emotions, no deep or complex sorrows. He was not allowed to grieve." In the story The Happy Man, the narrator explains, he recreated in his memory, for example, the death of his wife with his tragic circumstances, but the event seemed to him as a series of movements without meaning or effect, as if it happened to another woman, the wife of another man, in a remote age of ancient history. Nothing could touch his happiness. The memories of grief softly floated like gentle waves touching the sands of the shore. Whenever he heard the same reply from the other specialists, he laughed, then apologized laughingly for his laughter, as if that was the way to express anxiety and despair. He felt very lonely in the company of this overwhelming happiness. Both the man and Winston are forced to suppress negative thoughts. However, they both are severely unhappy because of their inability to feel grief. Together, these two examples show that emotions such as regret and grief allow us to move past tragic events in our lives. The lack of negative emotions such as grief restricts us from releasing anger and frustration within us. True happiness can only be achieved when happiness is paired with emotions such as sadness, regret, and grief. This is seen when Winston lives with Julia. He begins to express his negative emotions and cope with the past, allowing him to be happy. There are clearly some differences between the two stories as well. The man's suppression of negative emotions is because of an internal conflict. The man suffers from an extraordinary illness and is unable to feel negative emotions. Although he attempts to recall his most tragic memories, he is unable to feel any negative emotion. It is ironic that the man is unbelievably happy, but he feels upset and anxious because he is unable to feel negative emotions. Winston's suppression of negative emotions is because of an external conflict. Winston is able to feel sadness and grief, but is unable to express himself. The party doesn't want anybody to express individuality or emotions, so Winston must internalize his trauma. You could also argue that Winston suppresses his emotions because of an internal conflict as well. Therapists aid people who struggle to express themselves and understand their emotions. The party does the exact opposite. They teach young children that their emotions should serve the party alone. Both characters are unhappy because of their inability to express any negative emotions, proving that the suppression of negative emotions cannot bring happiness. My second point proving the thesis states that the inability to feel negative emotions ruins an individual's relationships with others. The lack of emotions such as empathy and regret causes individuals to lose the ability to create bonds with one another, forcing themselves into isolation. Winston's wife Catherine is an excellent example of this. In the book 1984 it says, she had two names for it. One was making a baby and the other was our duty to the party. Yes, she actually used that phrase. Quite soon he grew to have a feeling of positive dread when the appointed day came around, but luckily no child appeared. and in the end she agreed to give up trying, and soon after they parted. The lack of empathetic pain takes one's ability to form bonds with others. Winston's wife Catherine was an exceptional example of what the party wanted its citizens to behave like. The party spent years suppressing citizens' negative emotions until they could not feel empathy. Catherine felt no complex emotions and was unwilling to create an intimate bond with Winston. Her inability to create bonds with Winston made her despise her marriage. She clearly hated her marriage and dreaded having intercourse with Winston. She was lonely and unhappy, and because of her lack of empathy, she was not able to form relationships. In The Happy Man, the man is incredibly happy but is also anxious and sad because he realizes he cannot maintain his friendships. In the story, it says, will this feeling deprive him forever of his work and friends, of his sleep and peace of mind? Should he yield to it and drift with the current, or should he seek an outlet through mental effort, strenuous work, or professional advice? The man is questioning whether he is able to maintain his bonds with his friends because of his illness. He not only suffers from extreme happiness, he has also lost all his other emotions. The death of his wife makes him chuckle, and the issues around the world makes him laugh. It isn't the happiness that restricts him from maintaining his bonds, it's the lack of negative emotions such as empathy that would prevent him from keeping his friendships. Although he's really happy, the thought of being lonely, not having friends outweighs that. Both stories show how the suppression of one's negative emotions leads to the destruction of their bonds with others. Catherine's negative emotions were restricted because of the party's rules. The man's negative emotions were suppressed because of his illness. Both of these characters would live their lives out without concrete bonds with others, causing them to be unhappy. These two characters demonstrate how negative emotions are crucial in building relationships with others. Without empathy, it is impossible to build bonds. So, suppressing negative emotions is bound to destroy your bond with others, leaving you depressed and isolated, proving that suppressing negative emotions cannot bring happiness. So how does this thesis connect to real life? The thesis claims that suppressing one's negative emotions does not result in happiness. An excellent example is the use of recreational drugs. Drugs such as Xanax were developed to release pain and put people at ease. However, these drugs are now used recreationally and abused. They allow individuals to temporarily forget their negative emotions. The key to happiness and stability isn't the absence of issues. The key is to be able to efficiently process your negative emotions to move past your issues. Drugs allow us to suppress our negative feelings, but they do not bring happiness. Drug addicts are unsatisfied with their lives, frustrated with their emotions, and have ruined all of their relationships with others. This is very similar to what happens to the characters in the story who suppress their negative emotions. People abuse drugs to suppress their negative emotions, but it does not lead to happiness, like the thesis states. Another example is PTSD. PTSD and other trauma-related mental illnesses stems from the suppression of negative emotions. After a traumatic experience, your brain attempts to forget the memory and suppresses any emotions related to the event. This is why many victims of trauma cannot clearly remember the events. Therapy allows your brain to stop suppressing these negative emotions and deal with them in a healthy manner. Like the thesis claims, suppressing negative emotions similar to PTSD victims isn't helpful and does not cause happiness. To grasp satisfaction, one must process their emotions in a healthy manner instead of suppressing them, which would ultimately cause happiness. Archetypal criticism. The lone wolf archetype is apparent in both books. Winston is an independent single man who lives alone. He has severe rage towards the establishment and has a rebellious attitude. The man has lost his wife and his son has left him. He is truly alone, but he is fiercely independent. In the book "The Happy Man", it is said about the man, "You live intensely with your nerves, with your whole being, fighting fiercely as if any problem was a matter of life or death." Lone wolves are independent people who refuse any help. The use of the lone wolf archetype demonstrates the type of people who would suppress their issues instead of tackling them head on. I believe that independent, strong men are much more likely to suppress their emotions. Society stigmatizes emotions for men by telling males that showing your emotions is a sign of weakness. Men who understand and feel their emotions are seen as feminine and weak. The lone wolf archetype, who are usually strong, independent men, are emotionally struggling because of their inability to deal with their emotions, leading to them suppressing their emotions instead. And like the thesis states, because they end up suppressing their emotions, it does not lead to happiness. It leads to anxiety and sadness. Reader response criticism. The message of these stories could greatly vary from person to person. There are many people who don't believe that emotions are significant and question the legitimacy of mental health. The novel 1984 could be seen by those people as a perfect society in which there is no conflict and everyone is satisfied with their lives. It would prove that negative emotions such as guilt and grief are unnecessary. It could also be seen as a novel in which society has perfectly suppressed emotion, and yet this one individual who refuses to accept the system is jeopardizing everyone's happiness. The happy man could be seen as a tragedy. A man is blessed with eternal happiness, and yet he finds himself stressed and ungrateful because of the negative emotions such as grief that are suppressed by his illness. There are many societies in less developed parts of the world who don't understand the complexity of the human brain. The writer is depending on the belief that the audience is aware of the importance of emotions. Without knowing the importance of emotions and mental health, this message could not exist and would be interpreted differently. Investing in varying negative emotions sounds like an excellent idea because that would mean that people no longer have to worry or grieve in life. The true meaning of the text can only be identified when we understand why these emotions are important for our happiness and well-being. Historical criticism. The message of negative emotions can be interpreted differently depending on the era that it was read. In a different era, these stories would have been perceived completely differently. The stories may have been interpreted differently as shown in the reader response criticism 500 years ago when we knew very little about emotions. Unlike previous generations, we have advanced technologies such as EEG and skilled scientists who have explained the science behind emotions. We are aware of the importance of negative emotions as well as the consequences of suppressing them. We realize that Winston was correct to fight for his psychological rights, and the happy man was correct when he understood that his happiness was a curse because it suppressed important emotions such as grief and empathy. The people of a different era would not have reached the same conclusion as I have. The era that these books are written in significantly impacts message. Theme. Emotions are a major theme of these books, and it reappears throughout the two stories. In the book 1984, the government stays in power by controlling people's emotions. Individualism is not allowed, and people aren't allowed to feel any unnecessary emotions. People aren't allowed to develop any relationships either to prevent strong personal emotions. These laws are strictly enforced, punishing anyone who disobeys the laws surrounding emotions. Emotions are also a major theme in The Happy Man. The man wakes up one day and has completely lost control over his emotions. He becomes unimaginably happy and he cannot control himself. He becomes anxious because he realizes that he can no longer maintain a relationship with his friend as he can't stay serious. He seeks professional help because he can't control his emotions and is beginning to ruin his life. All these points and critical lenses prove that suppressing negative emotions does not lead to happiness.